Greetings, Missouri Mid-South. I want to check in with you about us as a conference. It's a new year, already the second month of the new year, and I think it was around this time last year that I introduced the theme of authenticity. The idea that as a conference, as a church, we need to be thoughtful about who we are and who we are not. And we need to be honest with ourselves and with one another about what that means for how we live together. We have to be who we are, who we sense God calling us to become, not who we think others want us to be, not trying to be all things to all people. We have to tell the full stories of who we are and have been, not just the shiny parts, not just the parts that make us feel good, not just the parts that we think make us look how we want to look. We have to trust that our authenticity, our honesty, our sincerity will help us to serve God and Christ's church, help us to find good partners in ministry and be good partners in ministry, help us to be faithful in our discernment of God's call, will help us to steward our resources effectively and meaningfully. You may have noticed in December that Merriam-Webster chose authenticity as their word of the year, which I did not anticipate, but I hope that it means that we're in touch with how God's Spirit might be moving in the cultural zeitgeist, in the wider conversation about our culture. The church is a part of culture, of the social fabric of the world, and I hope that we have some impact and awareness of our neighbors. But we're also different, separate from culture. And when we forget that and fool ourselves into thinking that we're the primary driver of culture or the primary influence in society, we align ourselves with forces of empire that are not who God is calling us to be. We have to be careful not to take the social position of the church for granted in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our world. We have to be careful not to misunderstand or misinterpret the social position of the church, the role of the church in society. A new Pew Research poll came out a couple of weeks ago declaring that the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are now the largest single religious demographic in America. 28% of Americans say they are no religion in particular. More than Catholics, more than evangelical Protestants, more than mainline Protestants. We are not the dominant religious voice anymore. And truly, we haven't been for a generation or more. But that reality is just not something many people have had the ability to admit openly. Not something even on an anonymous survey that they could say. And it's not a reality that we've been able to hear and acknowledge. Gone are the days when the Niebuhr brothers were on the cover of Time magazine. The segment of the American population that we know as nuns is a rapidly growing group, and they're a diverse group, and they're our neighbors, and our friends, and our coworkers, and our children. Most of them are not atheists. They are spiritual seekers, and they don't think they can find what they're looking for in the traditional church. I think they're wrong. I think mainline Protestantism, our churches, the United Church of Christ, is exactly what they're seeking. We're just really bad at telling the world about ourselves. I read the descriptions of what the nuns say they want, and I think, hello, we're right here. We are the spiritual community you're looking for. We don't need to chase anyone down and try to be what they're seeking. We need to be who we are authentically, and we need to do a better job of telling our stories, a better job of declaring ourselves to the world. When I was a local church pastor in my first call, I served a small congregation that couldn't afford a full-time salary for their pastor. And so for a while, I had a second job in a yarn shop. The woman who owned the shop was very cool. We were very much on the same page. We seemed to have a lot in common. I assumed she was a lot like me in terms of her life story and her experiences. And she turned to me one day during a slow afternoon in the shop and asked, so what happens in a church? What do you do there? I've never been inside one. I was shocked by her question. I stumbled to answer it, and I was a pastor. I was still a pretty new pastor with lots of recent practice telling my story and putting my theology down on paper, but I didn't know how to articulate to someone who was very much like me who we are and what we do in a language that she could understand. And I know I'm not the only Christian who's had a conversation like that. So now we're in a new year, and we've talked about authenticity, and we've talked about our stories, the ones we love and the ones we don't want to admit are true, and the ones we want to be a bigger part of who we become. And we need to recognize that authenticity by itself isn't enough. Authenticity isn't particularly important if we keep it to ourselves. Authenticity isn't particularly helpful if we can't articulate who we are to ourselves or to anyone else. So in the course of the next year together, I want to explore how we translate our authenticity beyond the walls of our churches, beyond the circle of insiders who are already in our congregations. I want us not to just tell our stories to ourselves, but learn how to tell them to others. We cannot assume that our neighbors just know who we are. We cannot assume that our friends, even our family members, know who we are. We have to be able to talk about it. We have to be able to describe it. And the way to do that is to describe what we value. We assume that we know. We assume that others know. What the research is telling us, though, is that a lot of people are looking for spiritual meaning, faith community that is rooted in exactly what we value. We're right under their noses, and they don't know it. And they don't know it because either we're not good at articulating our values or because we're not actually living out our values. We have to know what our values are, and we have to live like it. That's on us. We can't assume that others know. We can't assume that they see us. We can't assume that they understand us. And it's not someone else's fault that they don't know what we're not telling them. I want us to explore our values this year. Not our slogans, not our doctrine, not our declarations, but our values. The United Church of Christ is a big tent. The Missouri Mid-South Conference is a big tent. And I think sometimes we shy away from talking about things that are important to us because we are afraid that we might discover something we don't share in common, or we don't like about each other, or we don't like about ourselves. In order to be authentic, in order to be able to commit to real relationship in this big tent, we have to do that work. We're entering the season of Lent, and it's an appropriate time to examine ourselves, an appropriate time to dig deeper, an appropriate time to practice doing something that's hard or different or new. I'm going to start us off with an exploration of our values in upcoming videos. But I can't just make this all up on my own. I also want to hear from you. This is a conversation. What do you think our values are? Email me, call me, invite me to your church, ask me out to lunch. Talk about it in your Bible study groups, in your communities of practice, in your church councils, your cluster and association gatherings. What are our values as a church, as a conference? We'll engage this conversation not just during Lent, but through the whole year. There's a lot of work to do. So let's get to it in Jesus' name.